So let's talk a little bit. I sent you a little bit of a message before, kind of giving you a brief overview of what we wanted to talk about today for our audience. And you know, first we want to make the announcement that the summit is going to be available, or the date for the launch of the summit is November 18th, 19th, and 20th. My birthday week. My birthday's on the 19th, so that'll be pretty cool. Be able to watch the summit on my birthday. The registration for the summit actually opens up today, so people will be able to go on the website, which is takedownconfidencesummit.com, and they'll be able to register. We're going to post a link here in a minute for specifically for Sifu Cartmell, as far as how to access it for all of his friends and people that are on social media with us today. So the other thing I wanted to talk about, Tim, is real briefly is just kind of, let's go, you know, maybe you can share with our audience a little bit of your philosophy. You know, you and I talked about it in our interview on the summit, but your different approach on how you view takedowns instead of looking, I know that you kind of explained it to me, but maybe you can explain to the audience how you kind of looked at it, not necessarily from the person doing the takedowns perspective, but what happens to the person being thrown. Would you elaborate on that for us a little bit, please, sir?
Okay, so when I was training in Taiwan and China, also when I was a kid and I did kind of Kung-fu and other martial arts, I kind of heavily favored grapple throws, takedowns. So I was always super interested in just all around standing grappling when I was younger. So I started to, at the time I was in Asia, I started to think a lot about categorizing throws and getting better at throws, that kind of thing. When I started to compete, you know, I wanted to streamline my own training. That was the catalyst for it. And so I learned, you know, lots of throws like everyone does. And I started to think about the actual, there's the physical principles behind the throws, you know, like the technical idea. If you're going to do say a hip toss, your hips have to be lower than your opponent's hips. You know, there's those kind of things, but everybody knows that. And then I started to think about how people categorize throws, mostly to streamline training and teaching. So, you know, if you look at judo, Jigo Kano has hand throws or hand techniques, hip techniques, feet techniques. So everyone had these categorizations, and the Chinese martial arts had different ones to a certain extent. And I found it a little bit confusing why and not obviously not a criticism of the judo or anything else, but sometimes it was hard for me to understand why a throw was a hand throw when you still used your hip the same as a hip throw. Sometimes that's what it seemed like. And I just started to think about it a lot. So one day I was watching, we were training, and I was Sanda training. I was watching some other guys spar. And I was just watching when they were doing the takedowns, and somehow it just occurred to me that people always fall in the same patterns, right, when they're being thrown. So I started to get the idea that instead of categorizing throws by the guy doing the throw, what I'm doing, I started looking from the point of view as how do I just make that guy go into one of those patterns? So that obviously you'd have to train and no takedowns and throws, but then it's sort of just that idea. Very quickly, I felt like I was scoring more takedowns. So I would be in some position, and I would look for the opponent's dead angle, like the angles at which you couldn't apply force, or he didn't have a base. And then I would just try to make his mass go into it, kind of thing, with whatever throw was appropriate. Rather than before that, I would have, you know, an overhook, and I go, oh, okay, I got to get wrist control and set up my uchimata, my favorite throw kind of. I thought more along those lines, like or pummeling for grips until I got the grip I liked, and then I'd set up my throw sequence, which is fine. But when I started to get into positions, I would just think about how to get them into these trajectories, and then usually will come very quickly, and I'd get a takedown. And sometimes I didn't even know how I actually did it. I would just make them fall. And it eventually, it came down to this is how you do it. If you watch two people wrestling or doing takedowns, imagine the guy doing the throws is invisible, and just watch the guy being thrown down. So almost, I mean, you might, you know, push a guy or bump into a guy and he just kind of falls erratically. But when they're actually being what we would call it thrown or in a takedown, they fell in one of three patterns. They fell in an arcing pattern, a spiral pattern, or a circle pattern. And then I started to look at, the judo throws and the Swai Jiao throws, all the throws, and they almost invariably followed. There was really no exceptions for what we would call a throw or a takedown. So then I kind of, solidified this idea and tried to incorporate it into my own training first for a long time. And for me, anyway, for me, it really helped. It really helped my takedown game. And it also allowed me to self-correct. Like when something went wrong with the takedown, I mean, there's the obvious things, the guy stepped out of it or, whatever. But a lot of times, it'd be, you've done it, you have these, the same experience. You've done it. It's probably happened hundreds of times. You're fitting in, everything's good. And the guy's kind of defending and you're kind of like, man, why is this guy falling? And it would self-correct. I'd be like, oh, I didn't get into the trajectory, or I didn't get his, mass over his base kind of thing. And then I started to do seminars. I came back to the States to do seminars, and now I know a friend of mine, Dan Miller, he was a publisher. And I did a few seminars at his school, and he talked me into writing a book about it. I wrote Effortless Combat Throws in the early 90s. So I wrote that. That was basically that whole idea, just trying to present. So nothing really, I don't have any special throwing technique. I just have a different way, maybe a little different way of looking at it, the mechanics of it. And it was a huge help for me, but of course I kind of came up with it. But then when I taught my students, it seems to be not the only way, obviously, but it seemed to be a fairly streamlined method of getting the point across. And also, you have to have technique, of course. You have to have the right strategy, but you have to be able to be spontaneous in the middle of these movements, right? Change from movement to movement, and be able to adjust on the fly. That's kind of obviously the hallmark of a higher level fighter as opposed to more of a beginner. And I felt like viewing the throws from the guy, being thrown point of view, and understanding spirals, arcs, and circles allow people to kind of get into that little bit higher level ability to be spontaneous and chase the throw faster than they used to. Now that's of course based on my background. I mean, I'm sure other systems have something comparable, just with a different way of explaining it. But anyway, that was my take on it.
Yeah, when I first met you, I was a brown belt in judo, and so I had been, and I think you were a BJJ purple belt at the time, and those concepts really changed my perspective in how I practiced my judo. I had a Japanese instructor who didn't explain anything, and a fantastic instructor, but it was like, you do what he says and you do it until you die, right? And then that's just kind of how it works. But having that explanation, and one thing he did do for us that I really grew to appreciate later on was sometimes he would have us just be the uke, just receive throws, right? For, numerous repetitions. And you learn a lot from being thrown on how to apply a throw, right? And that was something that, of course, we didn't appreciate it at the time, but later on looking back, you're like, oh, okay, that's why he did that, is so we could understand how it's supposed to happen, right? So I think that's kind of similar to that concept, of studying it as the receiver, right? Only they don't really explain it to you, right? He didn't explain it. So just do this for a while, right? And then it's going to make your throws better. Okay, sir, that's how I'll do it. So, but I think that, that different mentality, you and I have talked about that before, where, where the East meets the West, here in the West, we don't really, we like to have that explanation as to why something works. Right. And I think with my Japanese instructor, it's like, you don't really get that. It's just, they just tell you to do it. Trust me, it works. Just do what I tell you to do. Right. And so there's a good blend there, I think, too. But I think that really changed my perspective after I met you and learned, about these concepts. It changed how I studied my takedowns and my throws. And then in turn, later on, I also tend to focus on the follow-up of the throw too, which is kind of, in judo, sometimes that gets overlooked because, once the throw is done, your game is done, in many cases. And so even though they have the pins, they have the newaza, they have, we have all that stuff, the joint locks and the strangles and everything once you hit the ground. But the intent is hopefully you don't have to use those in judo, because hopefully you're done with the throw. Hopefully it's a good quality throw, you're done. And so where it translated into jiu-jitsu for me was taking those takedowns and looking at what happens after the takedown, and what are my most direct paths to, you know, what my intent is in this entire, you know, situation. So, and I think that you know, the dead angle concept was, you were the first person I ever heard that from, and that was something that made a big difference in not just my takedowns, but also in that follow-up too. Because if you understand how a person is going to fall and the direction they're going to fall, right, and the impact, you know, that they're going to have, the position that they're going to land in, it's pretty easy for you to kind of map out, you know, and thread together what's going to happen after that. So that was all things that really influenced me in you know, in my growth in the takedown game. Like I said, I already had a little bit of a foundation. You know, I was a brown belt when I met you, so I understood throws, I understood takedowns, I guess, you know, to that level, to that depth, but hadn't looked at it in that reverse pattern, you know, how you do it that way. And I think I had already borrowed your book from I think Jason Elliott loaned it to me, and I think I still have his copy, by the way. He's traveling, he works for a train company, so he's all over the place right now, and so he says just hang on to that stuff. So I still have his copy of it, and but that was the first time I had been introduced to those things, and that was a fantastic book. I highly recommend it for our viewers to check it out. Effortless Combat Throws by Tim Cartmell. And then you have another book that I like a lot, which is A Passing Guard, and it comes it has some different concepts in it too that I really enjoyed. So, and that had to do with you know, I think understanding the concept of passing guard from various different positions and various different situations, and how they kind of, you know, they tie together. You know, the principles. You know, you and I have talked lots of times about how the, you know, principles are kind of locked in no matter, you know, what you're doing, if it's striking, grappling, on the ground, stand up, or whatever. And that's you know, that's another thing I wanted to mention was I also have focused here lately when translating these takedowns for BJJ, is looking at principles and concepts that jiu-jitsu people already do on the ground, and then translating that into this is how you can implement that in the stand-up, right? So sumigaishi, for example, is basically a butterfly sweep, right? And so if somebody can do a butterfly sweep and get that concept, I call it, it's a low-level sumigaishi, right? So it's just all you're doing is you're on the ground doing it. Now you just need to learn how to stand up and then roll into it, right? So and the off balancing, the angles, the dead angle, you know, you still use that when you're on the ground too. It's not any different. So all those things, you know, I credit you. That was you know, information that I got back in the mid late 90s that has stuck with me for, you know, for forever, and has helped influence you know, how I look at things and do things nowadays. So thank you so much for that, sir.
Yeah, I think you touched on a good point. When you're thinking about throws as well, right? I mean, in a judo competition, you get ippon. That's what, you know, obviously that's a fight ender or a match ender. But in jiu-jitsu, you have to keep fighting on the ground. And also in a real fight, you might have to keep fighting on the ground. And if it's a real fight, you have to be very careful that you don't throw the guy and then you hit the ground even harder than he did. So exactly, you know, understanding the trajectories to the ground and where you both end up is a very, so people that just do sport judo, you know, it might be something they'd maybe want to emphasize a little bit more, maybe outside the sport context, in case it's a fighting jiu-jitsu match, or in case you get in a real fight.
Yeah, and you know, I think it's the same for jiu-jitsu too. You know, there's things that we do in jiu-jitsu that are very sport oriented that you probably shouldn't do in a self-defense situation, you know. And the same thing for judo. There's certain things you do in the judo sport that probably wouldn't be a good idea in a combative situation either, you know. In judo, they're like wrestling, they're taught to turtle up, you know, or belly down to avoid the pin. That's not a good idea if you're in a combative situation. You know, that's one of the things I don't teach my students, by the way. We teach how to deal with those situations, but I don't teach them that is a defensive tactic. You know, that's not a good idea. So, you know, like we do work the turtle position, because you can end up there, you know, in a grappling situation, takedown situation. If you miss your single or double leg and, you know, end up, you know, the person sprawling on top of you, you're kind of in the turtle position for, you know, temporarily there. But we definitely don't teach it as a stalling position, right? That's not a good idea. So but yeah, so that crosses over. There's things in jiu-jitsu and there's things in judo that don't, I think in pretty much any martial art, that probably are more part of the art or part of the sport, not necessarily as practical for self-defense either.
Exactly.
Now I know you did a couple of DVDs that talked, you know, your groundproofing DVDs that also talked about the application of takedowns for self-defense primarily, right? Can you tell us a little bit about those?
So the groundproofing system, basically, what I saw, you know, this is 20 some years ago when I was, you know, in my lower belts in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. There was a lot of self-defense. I mean, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was originally designed as a self-defense system, although now it's morphed into, for the most part, just a sport art, right? But back in the day, I saw the transition. Like my earliest training, we did a lot of self-defense. You know, they had knives and gun, all that stuff. We would do it all. And then, you know, the sport part was with the gi or no gi. And that kind of just, it very, seemed to me like very quickly just all morphed into sport, because as tournaments got bigger and bigger, you know, teachers would make their reputation mostly on how well their students did in competition and that kind of thing. And then it attracted more and more athletes. It was, people just came to do jiu-jitsu like as a sport, right? Like you do judo, or they started to not really think about it as self-defense or any kind of fighting. And so like our academy is a little different because we spend a fair amount of time on it. You know, we glove up and they do all the self-defense, but it's, for the most part, it's you know, it's good and bad. I mean, if you just want to be an athlete and do jiu-jitsu, you know, why are you going to worry about self-defense? But it's a shame that it's not included. And so what I saw was it was kind of being phased out, and people in that kind of transition period back then, when jiu-jitsu still had this reputation from like the Valley Judo challenges, and people would come in and say, for example, to my Brazilian teacher, they'd be like, well, you know, I've done karate or I've boxed or whatever for a long time. You know, I feel like my stand-up's good, but I don't know anything about being on the ground. So I just want to, you know, can I learn self-defense on the ground? Or if I get knocked down, what do I do? And invariably the teachers would be like, exactly what we teach. And then they would make them buy an expensive gi and put them in beginner jiu-jitsu class for sport. And you'd have to train a couple of years to extrapolate, maybe a year or so, to extrapolate out what you needed. And I felt like, that wasn't, I mean, it might have been a sneaky good business ploy, but it wasn't really fair. And so I was, that was the catalyst for this. So I put together a system. It's for for non-grapplers, people that don't know anything about, they don't know how to fall even yet, and they get in a fight. We're not worried now. This doesn't address stand-up fighting. So I'm just talking about you're brawling however you're brawling, and the fight goes to the ground, and that was it. So I teach it in seminars quite often, and I teach the entire method in a weekend, on a Saturday and Sunday. So it's not, if you've done jiu-jitsu for a while, you know, say a year or two, I could explain it to you in 30 minutes. You'd already be, you know, what I would recommend, the strategy. But if you haven't done anything on the ground, I talk about basic ground falls or break falls. You know, you have to be able to fall safely, nothing fancy. And then it's just divided into two parts. Ground fights are divided into, you're on the ground and your opponent's still standing, right? So you have to address, can he kick me or hit me with something, or can he get on top of me? And that's part A. Part B is you're both on the ground. If you're up and he's down, you're not ground fighting. You can run away, right? Or you can kick him. So we don't talk about, it's not sport or anything. We don't have to pass the guard. We don't have to control the guy. Like if I knock you down, I can run. So the whole first part is you get knocked down. It's just how to orient your feet, right? How to, you know, keep your feet towards the opponent, how to make space with basic ground kicks, and how to technical rise and get back up to your guard. That's part A. And when we get to the ground, I only address the most basic things that happen. Scarf hold, right? Headlocks on the ground, top mount. We do a little on the side, and then very little on the back. We're not expecting this to be a jiu-jitsu expert on the ground. So it's just basically, and the emphasis though is on you're getting hit. You know, if you're in a scarf hold, I mean, we did it as kids. If I have you in a headlock on the ground, I'm going to punch you in the face, that kind of thing. So the techniques are the exact same ones we'd use in sport, but only the ones that keep you safe. Like you just mentioned, there are a lot of great techniques where maybe I'm trying to, like, you know, scissor your head and then I'm going to turn over to Kimura. None of that, because you're on the ground too long. So it's just how to defend yourself from the position. It could be submissions, but mostly the strikes on the ground, and how to get back up. So that's the ground proofing. So I got the name. I had a friend that was a Navy SEAL that I trained with for a long time, you know, and he talked about drown proofing, where they throw them in the pool with gear on.
Oh, right.
Yeah, you're not going to be an Olympic swimmer. You're just not going to drown with your gear on. So that's why I came up with the name, called it ground proofing. So that's yeah. So that's the idea of it. And if you guys have done Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for any length of time, you already have more techniques than you need. You just have to know which ones to use in a real fight.
Yeah. I think that's a great thing too, because I think sometimes we do get kind of caught up in what we do inside the dojo, inside the academy with our training partners, and that's jiu-jitsu versus jiu-jitsu, right? And that's not necessarily how an attacker is going to behave, right? And so I think it's good to kind of step back and take a look at that from time to time. We always talk about rolling with white belts as kind of like the time to practice your self-defense, because they do all the weird stuff sometimes, right? They're not using jiu-jitsu yet. They're using whatever other skills they have. So
also, just as a note for the guys, anyone watching that does jiu-jitsu. So in my old academy, you know, I had MMA fighters, but everyone in my general class, every Thursday night when we rolled, everyone had MMA gloves on. You hit each other. Now, again, not killing each other, but enough, you know, to have a real awareness of positioning. So no one really gets too comfortable with, you know, super sport, only sport danger, you know, and I'm all for it. You have to learn it, you know, you want to compete, but you should have just in your mind, like, if I really get taken down, what is the intensity and the strikes will, I mean, all basic jiu-jitsu is what you want, but you got to be a little bit used to it, right? So, you know, you guys, once in a while, you might put your mouth guard in and put gloves on and you know, make light to moderate contact and roll around and hit each other and see how it goes.
Yeah, we used to do that a lot. I've been talking about implementing that again, because I think it really has a good application to remind you of those positions that we get too comfortable sometimes, you know, and you're gonna lay there and you're gonna hold somebody, you know, or you're gonna pull you know, deep half guard or something. It's like, no, that guy could hit you in the face a lot from there, so that might not be a place to hang out at, you know, camp out there. So I think it's a great practice, and like you said, it's really light, very light strikes, just enough to kind of, you know, pit pat, just enough to let them know that this is a danger zone and you need to adjust, right? So I totally agree with that. And that's, like I said, it's something we used to do a lot of, mostly because we taught MMA back then, you know, but nowadays we're just primarily judo and jiu-jitsu. But I still think it's a super important part of, you know, getting acquainted with the self-defense portion of what we do, for sure. So I got a little note here from Olga reminding me that we're running short on time here. So I want to remind everybody who's watching the link for the summit is in our comments section right here. So be sure to check that out and make sure that you get registered for the Takedown Confidence Summit, which is going to be November 18th, 19th, and 20th. There'll be 10 speakers per day. Tim happens to be one of our speakers. This is just a brief little portion, a preview of what's to come. So for those of you that want to get on the summit, you're going to see Tim, and you're going to see 29 other speakers. And then there's an all access pass option also that you can sign up for, that gives you access to takedowns that each one of our speakers has also filmed, and other things like an MP3 audio version of the interviews, lifetime access to the interviews, so and numerous other things. You can check that out on the website when you go there. So be sure to check for the link in the comments. And I want to thank you. Now I call you Sifu. Do your students there call you Professor or Sifu?
They call me Tim.
Tim, hey Tim. Right.
About it. Yeah.
We've gotten so used to using the Japanese terminology here that I get called sensei more than I ever get called my real name. And there'll be occasions when we're in town someplace and somebody will shout out sensei, and we just know that I think they're talking to me, because I don't know if there's a whole lot of us around in this town. So but yeah, thank you again, sir. And it was, you know, a pleasure talking to you. It's always a pleasure talking to you and connecting with you. And I want to thank you again for being part of the summit. I know that you know, that's was you know, an awesome thing to have you on there. And then also, I know I already watched the takedown video, and so I'm looking forward to sharing that with other people. So everybody, make sure that you get connected with that all access pass. So thank you again, sir.
Thank you, and thanks everyone who watched.
Thank you. I hope you have a great day.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.